They illegally occupied my family barn for their $100,000 charity gala without permission. So I released my two 2,200-pound prize bulls into their fancy party. 50 socialites in designer gowns fled screaming while my bulls destroyed everything. The HOA president who started this war? She paid $50,000 and resigned in disgrace. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. They said my barn was the perfect venue for their charity gala. I said my prize bulls needed some entertainment too. My name is Jake Morrison and I own Hillcrest Ranch, 200 acres of prime farmland that my grandfather bought in 1952. Back then it was all farms and open country. Now it's surrounded by Meadowbrook Heights, the most pretentious gated community you've ever seen, where houses start at $2 million and the HOA fees cost more than most people's rent. The problem started when Margaret Whitfield moved into the $4 million mansion that borders my property. Margaret wasn't just wealthy, she was old money wealthy, the kind of woman who'd never worked a day in her life but somehow felt qualified to tell everyone else how to live theirs. She became HOA president within 6 months and immediately declared war on anything that didn't fit her vision of upscale country living. My barn was her first target. It's a beautiful structure, built by my grandfather with hand-hewn beams and fieldstone foundation. The barn houses my prize Angus bulls, Thor and Hercules, each weighing over 2,200 pounds of pure muscle and attitude. These aren't just farm animals, they're championship breeding stock worth $50,000 each. The first complaint letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier like some kind of legal document. Expensive letterhead, perfect penmanship, and words that made my blood pressure spike. Dear Mr. Morrison, the Meadowbrook Heights Community Board has received numerous complaints regarding the unsightly agricultural structure visible from Magnolia Drive. The barn's rustic appearance detracts from our neighborhood's refined aesthetic. We strongly encourage you to consider renovating or relocating this facility to maintain property values. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. This woman wanted me to move a 70-year-old barn because it hurt her feelings? I'd been here decades before her fancy neighborhood existed. I decided to ignore the letter. Big mistake. Margaret's response was swift and creative. She organized neighborhood tours that brought groups of potential homebuyers directly past my property, pointing out the barn as an example of ongoing community improvement opportunities. She started a petition demanding the county reclassify my land as residential. She even contacted my insurance company claiming the bulls posed a public safety hazard. But her masterstroke was discovering an obscure county ordinance about agricultural structures within 500 feet of residential zones. Suddenly, I was facing code violation hearings and potential fines that could force me to tear down my grandfather's barn. That's when I realized Margaret Whitfield wasn't just entitled. She was dangerous. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in October. I was in town getting feed supplies when my neighbor Tom called with news that made my vision blur with rage. "Jake, you need to get home right now," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "There are about 50 cars parked on your property, and they're setting up some kind of party in your barn." I broke every speed limit getting home. What I found in my driveway was a scene from my worst nightmare. Luxury cars lined my gravel road. Catering trucks were unloading champagne and fancy appetizers. Event staff were hanging silk drapes from my grandfather's hand-hewn beams and setting up cocktail tables where my bulls' feed bins belonged. A DJ was testing sound equipment that probably cost more than my tractor. And there, standing in the center of my barn in a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, was Margaret Whitfield directing the transformation of my working farm into her personal party venue. I parked my truck and walked straight into the barn, my boots echoing off the stone floor that 3 generations of Morrison men had walked. The chatter stopped as 50 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the angry farmer crashing their setup. "Excuse me," I said, my voice deadly calm. "But this is private property and you're all trespassing." Margaret smiled that condescending smile wealthy people perfect in finishing school. "Oh Jake, don't be dramatic. We're hosting the Meadowbrook Heights annual charity gala to raise money for underprivileged children. Surely you wouldn't want to deny disadvantaged kids this opportunity?" The manipulation was masterful. She positioned herself as a children's advocate and me as the villain for objecting to strangers occupying my barn without permission. "I don't care if you're raising money for world peace," I replied. "You don't have permission to be here. Leave now." Margaret's mask slipped just enough to reveal the steel underneath. "Actually, Jake, we do have permission. The county granted us a special events permit for this location after we explained the agricultural safety concerns." Apparently, housing dangerous animals so close to a residential area violates several health codes. She pulled out an official-looking document with county letterhead. The permit was real, signed by someone I'd never heard of, authorizing temporary use of agricultural facility for community benefit pending resolution of safety violations. I'd been outmaneuvered by a woman who'd turned my own government against me. The party starts at 7, Margaret continued sweetly. We'll be done by midnight. Try not to cause a scene, there will be media coverage for the charity. That's when I noticed the local news crew setting up cameras outside. Margaret had planned this perfectly. If I forced them to leave, I'd be the heartless farmer disrupting a children's charity on live television. But Margaret Whitfield had made one crucial mistake. She knew nothing about bulls. I smiled and tipped my hat like the polite country gentleman she expected me to be. Well then, I hope you folks have a wonderful evening. Don't mind me, I'll just be doing my regular evening chores. The confusion on her face was delicious. She'd expected a fight, maybe even hoped for one to make me look unreasonable on camera. Instead, I was graciously accepting defeat. Or so she thought. I spent the next few hours preparing for the best revenge of my life. First, I moved Thor and Hercules from their usual pasture to the holding pen directly behind the barn, close enough that they could hear and smell everything happening inside their territory. Bulls are territorial animals, and these two had been claiming this barn as their domain for 5 years. Next, I did something I'd never done before. I fed them late. Bulls on a schedule get irritated when that schedule changes. Hungry territorial bulls get downright aggressive. Finally, I waited. The party started at 7 sharp. Through my kitchen window, I watched luxury cars disgorging passengers in designer gowns and expensive suits. The local news crew interviewed Margaret about her charitable work while she stood in front of MY Barn like she owned it. By 8 o'clock, the party was in full swing. I could hear laughter, music, and the clink of champagne glasses echoing from the barn. Margaret had transformed my working farm into her personal showcase, and she was probably feeling very pleased with herself. That's when I put on my work clothes and headed outside to do my evening chores. Thor and Hercules were pacing in their pen, agitated by the noise and strange smells coming from their barn. At 2,200 pounds each, these bulls were magnificent animals. Massive shoulders, powerful necks, and eyes that could intimidate a lion. They'd been bred for strength and stamina, not gentleness. I opened the gate to their pen and stepped aside. Go get 'em, boys. What happened next was beautiful chaos. Thor hit the barn door first, his massive bulk splintering the wooden frame like matchsticks. The sound of 2,200 pounds of angry bull crashing through their own front door cut through the party music like a chainsaw. The screaming started immediately. Hercules followed his buddy through the destroyed doorway, and suddenly 50 of Meadowbrook Heights' finest were sharing cocktail space with 2 territorial bulls who were not happy about uninvited guests in their home. I'd never seen people in formal wear move so fast. Designer gowns were hiked up to sprint-appropriate lengths as guests climbed onto cocktail tables, speakers, and anything else that might provide safety from ground level. High heels were abandoned in favor of barefoot escape attempts. The DJ abandoned his equipment and scrambled onto the hay loft. The catering staff dropped expensive champagne to climb the support beams. Someone knocked over the silk drapes, which spooked Hercules into knocking over the cocktail table, which sent appetizers flying across my grandfather's stone floor. But the most beautiful sight was Margaret Whitfield, standing frozen in the center of the chaos as Thor approached her with the kind of interest bulls show when they want to establish dominance. Her designer dress, her perfect makeup, her entitled confidence, all meaningless in the face of 2,200 pounds of irritated beef. "Jake," she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "Do something." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, enjoying the show. "Sorry, Margaret, but those safety violations you mentioned? Bulls can be pretty dangerous. Wouldn't want anyone to get hurt because of my negligent animal management." The next 20 minutes were the most entertaining of my life. Guests who'd arrived in luxury cars were now fleeing through pastures in formal wear, dodging cow pies and Italian leather shoes. The news crew got footage they'd never forget, society folks running from bulls while a farmer watched with obvious satisfaction. Thor and Hercules, meanwhile, were having the time of their lives. They knocked over every table, destroyed the sound equipment, and generally reclaimed their territory with the enthusiasm of homeowners evicting squatters. When animal control finally arrived, they found 2 content bulls munching on expensive canapés while party guests cowered in the hay loft like refugees from a natural disaster. Margaret tried to have me arrested for reckless endangerment, but the sheriff just laughed. "Ma'am, those bulls live in that barn. If you didn't want to meet them, maybe you shouldn't have thrown a party in their house. The local news coverage was everything I could have hoped for. Video of socialites fleeing from bulls went viral within hours. Margaret's charity gala became a laughingstock, and her reputation as a sophisticated hostess was destroyed along with her event. But the real victory came 2 weeks later when I received an official letter from the county. Margaret's complaint about agricultural safety had triggered a full investigation of her permit process. Turns out, she'd lied on her application, claiming she had landowner permission and that the property posed no animal hazards. The county not only revoked her permit but fined her $10,000 for permit fraud and held her liable for all property damage, including my barn door that Thor had demolished making his grand entrance. Margaret's homeowner's insurance refused to cover the damages, claiming deliberate trespassing and livestock encounters weren't covered under standard policies. She ended up paying $25,000 out of pocket for repairs to my barn, replacement of the destroyed party equipment, and medical bills for 3 guests who'd injured themselves fleeing from my bulls. The best part? The whole incident was recorded by her own news crew and became evidence in the insurance investigation. But Margaret Whitfield wasn't finished. If anything, the humiliation made her more determined to destroy me. She filed complaints with every government agency she could find. Code enforcement, animal control, environmental protection, fire department. Suddenly I was being inspected by officials who'd never bothered me in 30 years of farming. Most of the inspections found nothing, but Margaret had done her homework. She discovered that my property straddled 2 different zoning classifications, and the barn sat precisely on the boundary line. With the right legal pressure, she could potentially force a rezoning that would eliminate agricultural exemptions. Her lawyer, some hotshot from the city who specialized in land development, filed a lawsuit claiming my farming operation constituted a nuisance enterprise incompatible with residential development. The suit demanded I relocate my bulls, tear down the barn, and pay damages for diminished property values and quality of life impacts. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an attempt to destroy my family's legacy. That's when I decided Margaret needed to learn what real consequences looked like. I spent the next month researching everything about Meadowbrook Heights and Margaret's precious HOA. What I discovered made my farmer's heart sing with vindictive joy. Meadowbrook Heights had been built on land purchased from 3 different farms in the 1990s. The developers had promised to maintain rural character and agricultural heritage as selling points for their luxury community. They'd even kept some of the original farmland as green space and marketed the neighborhood as country estate living. But here's the beautiful part. The original land purchase agreements included agricultural easements that protected farming rights in perpetuity. The developers had agreed to these easements to get tax breaks and environmental approvals for their construction project. Margaret's HOA was legally required to protect and support agricultural operations in the area. Her campaign against my farm wasn't just harassment, it was a violation of the very agreements that made her precious neighborhood possible. Armed with this knowledge, I hired my own lawyer. Not some fancy city attorney but Bill Henderson, a local guy who specialized in agricultural law and had a personal grudge against developers who tried to push around farmers. Bill filed a countersuit that made Margaret's complaint look like a parking ticket. We sued for harassment, interference with agricultural operations, violation of easement agreements, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We demanded she pay all my legal fees, issue a public apology and resign from the HOA board. But the real masterstroke was including Thor and Hercules as agricultural assets subjected to harassment and unauthorized disturbance. We claimed the stress from repeated HOA complaints and illegal entry into their habitat had damaged their breeding value and demanded compensation for livestock psychological trauma. I'm not sure bulls can experience psychological trauma, but Margaret's lawyer would have to prove they couldn't. The case never went to trial. Margaret's attorney took one look at the agricultural easements and advised immediate settlement. Turns out, fighting farmers on agricultural land is expensive, especially when you're legally obligated to support their operations. The settlement was everything I'd hoped for. Margaret paid $50,000 in damages and legal fees, issued a written apology that was published in the local newspaper, and resigned from the HOA board in disgrace. She also signed an agreement promising never to interfere with my farming operations again. But the sweetest victory was the new barn door. As part of the settlement, Margaret had to pay for a custom replacement door with a bronze plaque that read, Morrison Family Farm EST 1952. Protected by agricultural easement and 2,200-pound security system. 6 months after the bull incident, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset over my pastures when Tom stopped by with a beer and some gossip. "You hear about Margaret Whitfield?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "What about her? House is up for sale. Apparently, she can't handle living next to a working farm." Tom grinned. "Real estate agent told me she's been complaining about agricultural odors and noise pollution to potential buyers. Funny thing is, disclosure laws require her to mention the livestock encounter incident to anyone considering the property." I raised my beer in a toast to Thor and Hercules, who were grazing peacefully in the pasture where my grandfather had first brought cattle 70 years ago. "Sometimes," I said, "bulls make the best neighbors." The new HOA president turned out to be a retired farmer who understood that agricultural heritage was part of what made the area special. Under his leadership, Meadowbrook Heights embraced its rural connections instead of fighting them. They even started hosting an annual Farm Day event where residents could learn about agricultural operations and meet the animals. Thor and Hercules became local celebrities. Kids from the neighborhood would ask their parents to drive past our fence just to see the famous bulls who'd crashed the fancy party. I started giving educational tours for school groups, teaching children about sustainable farming and animal husbandry. The barn door incident became legendary in our county. Other farmers facing HOA pressure started calling me for advice on dealing with entitled neighbors who didn't understand agricultural rights. I even spoke at a state conference about protecting family farms from residential development pressure. But the most satisfying outcome was watching Margaret's mansion sit empty for 8 months before finally selling at a $400,000 loss. The new owners turned out to be a lovely couple who'd grown up on farms themselves and actually appreciated having agricultural neighbors. As I finish writing this story, I can see Thor and Hercules in their pasture, content and peaceful in their domain. My grandfather's barn stands strong, protected by law and legend. The plaque on the door catches the evening light, reminding everyone who passes that some things are worth fighting for. Margaret Whitfield taught me that entitled people will always try to impose their vision on others, especially those they see as beneath them. But she also taught me that every entitled person has a weakness, and sometimes that weakness is simple ignorance about the power of 2,200 pounds of irritated beef. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Sometimes the best response to legal harassment is creative problem solving. And sometimes the most effective security system has 4 legs, weighs over a ton, and doesn't require electricity. My grandfather always said that good neighbors respect boundaries and bad neighbors need to be taught respect. Thor and Hercules turned out to be excellent teachers. The barn door is always open for educational visits, but party planners should call ahead. Bulls don't RSVP, but they definitely crash parties.